It's good to have you here.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Neal's with EcoTea. So what we want to do today is Sunrise Regen Ag, which is a new business that Ken and I started. And we're going to do a new number of podcasts, and we want to talk about different products, biological products that help, and the end user to do a better job of farming. So today I thought we would talk about residue digester, and I know you've been working with it for a number of years now.
Yep.
And what is EcoTea residue digester, and how did it come to be? I know you have other products, and if you want to just maybe give us a little background how it came to be.
Yeah, so EcoTea residue digester it's a soil applied product, and what it is it's a biological product that has a high fungal content in it, and the fungi in the product are actually what's called saprophytic fungi. So saprophytic fungi feed on dead and decomposing material. Mm-hmm. So the theory behind this product was when the owner and inventor of the company started looking into the different species that we had in our product, he was able to identify that there were an abundance of these fungi in the product. And knowing that they feed on dead and decaying material, looking at an agricultural system, he thought that if you were able to apply this to your crop residue, it might actually help speed up the breakdown of that residue. And crop residue is, in some situations it's good, and in some situations it's bad. It's different for every farm and every farmer. So understanding when you want it to break down faster, which is typically in the spring when you're seeding. Yep. Crop residue can have a number of effects when you're seeding. It can affect seed placement. So when you're talking about, depending on the seed size, something like a canola seed that's very, very small, when you're trying to seed that at 1/4 of an inch, if you've got a piece of residue in the ground that's blocking that seed from getting all the way in, or if it's covering that seed, it can affect the germination, and it can also affect the machinery. It can plug when the seed's coming out. It can wrap on the machinery. So there's a host of issues when it comes to seeding with residue.
Yeah. Well, you sort of answered the next question. What is residue management? But maybe just like why do it?
So residue management, it's not about a product necessarily like ours. I think it's more of a systems approach. But as I was alluding to, depending where you are and what time of the year, you have to understand. Some guys will take all the residue off at the end of the season. Mm-hmm. Some guys like to leave it standing. They want to catch as much snow as possible, retain the moisture. And then depending on the crop that you're taking off, some residues like wheat residue, if you have a heavy crop, it can be pretty thick come the spring. But if you're dealing with something like corn, where it's very large and it's very tough and it doesn't break down, it can significantly affect what you're doing next spring. So it's about making those decisions, how you're going to manage it and what you're going to do to manage it. I think one important thing that's not necessarily talked about when talking about residue management is, understanding that leaving some residue on the field, absolutely necessary in some areas. But when you are taking off that residue, you're pulling it right off the field, you're exporting all of what's in the residue. And when I say exporting, I mean you're pulling it right out of the field. Yeah. So you're pulling out the residual nitrogen in that residue. You're pulling out any organic matter contained in that residue. So when we're talking about building soils and building healthy soils, residue can be an issue, it can be a problem, but at the same time, there's a host of benefits that come with that residue. Yeah. One thing that when I started, I didn't realize this and came to realize it later, and it was a bit of an epiphany, was it doesn't matter how finely you chop up your residue. If you chop it up into 1/4 inch pieces and it's getting pushed back into the soil, that's great. But the only thing that's actually breaking down that residue is biology. So you can chop it as small as you want, but once it gets into the soil, the only way it's getting broken down is through biological processes in the soil, and specifically bacteria and fungi degrading that residue.
Why is fungi important in the agricultural system?
So fungi are super important in the agricultural system, and I think a little bit neglected. I know when we talk about, most of the time when you hear fungi referred to in agriculture, we're talking about fungicides. So there are pathogens, diseases that are fungal borne. And so fungicides, whether they're on the seed or sprayed onto the plant, are used to kill those pathogens and those diseases. But I believe, and I'm not quite sure on this number, but I believe it's only 2% of the fungi in the soil are pathogens or diseases. The other 98% are either plant beneficial or neutral. So fungi are super important in an agricultural system because they actually have a host of functions that are similar to bacteria but different. And if you think about an ecosystem, you always want to have a balance. Too much of one thing isn't always a great thing. And the use of fungicides, whether they're on the seed or sprayed onto the plants and drip down into the soil, that degrades the fungi in the soil. And then agricultural practices degrade the fungi in the soil. If you think about fungi, they're like a plant. It's almost like a plant root system. They're growing throughout the soil. And when you seed, you disturb the soil. When you till, you disturb the soil. And these are all practices that farmers need to do to achieve the result they're looking to achieve. Yeah. But understanding that every time you're doing something like that, you're degrading all of those fungi in the soil. So it's really important to try and achieve a balance between your fungi and your bacteria in the soil. And typically in a conventional agricultural system, you're going to end up with bacterial dominant soils. So incorporating fungi into the practices that you do, and whether it's, reducing your disturbance of the soil where you can, or if you're looking at using products specifically like our residue digester product, or there's a lot of products out there like mycorrhizal fungi that you can add when you're seeding, or broadcasting onto the land and adding those back into the soil. That's super important in achieving that balance, bringing kind of a balanced soil microbiome, that ecosystem, and then helping those two populations work in concert so they can both perform their specific functions.
How can I, or as a grower, how can I balance my fungi to a bacterial ratio in the soil?
So as I was alluding to there, ways to balance it, again, looking at what practices you're doing. So how often you're disturbing the soil, how much you're disturbing the soil, right? So are you going in with a deep tiller or a deep ripper? I mean, the deeper you go into the soil, the more you're disturbing it. Fungi don't just exist in the top 2 inches. They're going to go all the way out through that soil profile. So looking at what different practices you're using, and then also, looking at, are you able to reduce using some of those products that are harmful to fungi? Yeah. So is it, reducing your use of fungicide seed treatment, which we've seen through, specifically through our products, we can stop using fungicide seed treatments and still have a successful crop. Looking at reducing fungicide applications, which is about creating a healthy soil ecosystem. Yeah. So, building up healthy soil, what happens is you have suppression of all the diseases through competition. So if you have a bunch of beneficial bacteria and a bunch of beneficial fungi in your soil, you're going to have a healthier soil. Those pathogens may be present, but they're not going to be able to attack the plant because they're being outcompeted by all of the beneficial biology in the soil. And then specifically looking at products that can add fungi into the soil. And I think it's important to say, these aren't practices that you do it once and you're good for the rest of time. It's more about that maintenance. Building a healthy soils is about maintaining it properly. And that's something you do over time. But having said that, that doesn't necessarily mean it has to be an every year practice. So with a product like our residue digester, it's more of how does it fit into your rotation. So it doesn't have to go on every acre, every season. It might just be, for example, it might just be following your corn rotation. And after you've done corn, now you're spraying on the residue digester, you're helping break down that corn residue, and then you're also adding those fungi back into the soil. I think it's important to, when we're talking about, specifically saprophytic fungi that are in our product, I think it's important to also talk about the fact that those saprophytic fungi breaking down the residue, they're actually excreting organic acids to help break down those tough lignins and cellulose in the residue. And if you don't have saprophytic fungi, what's happening is bacteria are breaking it down. So bacteria will still break down your residue, but when bacteria break down your residue, they actually tie up nitrogen in the process of breaking down that residue. So, if you have a really heavy crop, you go into the fall, the agronomist might say, okay, based on your yield targets, you're going to apply X amount of nitrogen, and they're actually accounting in that nitrogen budget. They're accounting for nitrogen to be tied up because the bacteria are breaking down that residue. Right. And what we've seen now through 5 years of trials, third-party trials, is that when you're using specifically saprophytic fungi, they're actually able to break down that residue and not tie up nitrogen. So you're getting a surplus of nitrogen in the spraying as opposed to a deficit, a tie-up. So, and that's through 5 years now of third-party research that we've been able to see this time over time. When we're talking about an exact number, because it's an ecosystem, it's like farming, there's so many variables, it's hard to say. Sometimes, you might have more leftover nitrogen here than you would over on this quarter, but that process is taking place.
Yeah, I had a chance to see some research being done at the plant there, and it's very, very impressive. So my last question is, and on a practical basis, I understand it's a liquid. Applying it, what equipment do you need, and when's an ideal time, or when can you apply it?
Yeah, so equipment-wise, it's applied as a broadcast application, so you do need a sprayer. In terms of timing, it is flexible. The best time to apply is in fall, simply because if you can apply after the crop is taken off, fungi, unlike bacteria, actually work up to about 0 degrees soil temperature, and bacteria stop at around 5 degrees. So if you apply in the fall, you do have a window, depending on that application date and where you are in the country before the snow flies, that fungi is actively working at breaking down that residue. So a fall application is ideal. We have done testing, and we've been able to show that you can tank mix it with your post burn down or your pre burn down in the spring. So spring application is also an option. To talk specifically about some of the work that we've done and the trials that we've done here in southern Manitoba, we actually just completed a trial, field scale trial, this past year. It was done on 120 acres. And what we did was we looked at varying rates of our product versus no application of the residue digester. And soil tests came back. We fall applied it, and soil tests came back, and they looked good. You could see some differences, but not massive. And it's important to say, when working with biology, it's like turning a ship at sea. Things it's not a magic bullet. It's not gonna, one night you spray it and the next day you wake up and everything's changed. It does take some time. So the soil tests came back from this trial. They looked good, some differences, but nothing massive. We went out and hosted a field day in the summer, and we were able to see some pretty cool stuff. Fungi it's a visual thing. If you know what you're looking for, you can go out in the field and you can find where you've applied the product and where you haven't. You'll be able to see, they're called fungal hyphae. They're basically just little white strands growing on your residue. We were able to see some of that, and so we thought that, okay, we're on to something here. It's working, and we sort of knew what we were looking for after 5 years of research now. Yeah. And so we just got the report back from that 1 year trial, and it was sprayed on corn residue, and it was done with the crop planted into it was edible beans, and it actually did create a yield response in the crop, which was super promising, very exciting. Now we don't take one trial in 1 year and treat that as gospel, but understanding that these are the processes that are happening. Here's our hypothesis of what we would like to see happen, or what we think might happen. And then, we'll wait and see what the result is. And the result was a yield response. Because it's biology, because it's so different year to year, I'm not sure we would expect to see a yield response every year. But what I think that we're comfortable in saying now is that corn residue where it was applied is becoming less of a problem or was less of a problem for the farmer to deal with. And as it's being incorporated, once you've applied those fungi, they're the practices that I talked about, the fungicides and tillage and, disturbing the soil, that's going to break them down, but they are actively working on that residue. And once it gets onto that residue, it's working. So I would expect to see that there will be carry-on effects from that application in the coming years. That trial specifically isn't going to be a multi-year trial. But one of the things that we've tried to do as a company and we're understanding now is that we really want to start focusing on doing multi-year trials on the same land, because back to that analogy of turning a ship at sea, you might not see the biggest or best results in year one. It is a bit of a systems approach that you have to commit to. But we do have some multi-year sites that we've been able to see after 3 years, some pretty significant results that are leading us to do more research.
Very good. Well, thanks, Neal. Thanks
Absolutely.
for being a guest on the Sunrise Regen podcast.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
And I find this residue digester product very interesting. And we'll hopefully have you back again on another. I know EcoTea has a lot of good products, and we'd love to bring the information to our listeners.
Absolutely. Well, thanks for having me, and look forward to chatting again.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you.